Hear the word of the Lord from Mark 5:21 through 43. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She'd suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she'd spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she'd gotten worse. She'd heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe, for she thought to herself, "If I can just touch his robe, I will be healed." Immediately, the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." While he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now." But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just have faith." Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him, except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep." The crowd laughed at him. But he made them all leave, and he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was laying. Holding her hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. Well, good morning, Sojourn. Peace be with you. It's good to see you guys this morning. Good to be with you. My name's Jonah. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're a guest with us, welcome. Our mission as a church is to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's the good news of who he is and what he has done for us. Then to build one another up as his church and send each other to follow him as instruments of truth, beauty, and goodness. Thankful that you're here to be a part of that. It's a fun day for us to have Ryan Marsh back, as we said earlier. If you're a guest, don't know, Ryan was on staff with us for many years. He started attending this church as a teenager, came on staff, sent him out a few months ago to be a part of Carl Road Baptist Church, a revitalization happening up in Columbus. So he's back in town for Harvest Homecoming. It's just, it feels like our kid coming home from college. Ryan's not in the room, is he? I can say that, right? I don't want that to be paternalistic, but boy, we love that guy, and it's good to have him back. Plus Harvest Homecoming, y'all get those mini donuts, dumplings, what? Island noodles? Huh? Am I the only one? Nope, just me. Mini donuts? Yeah, there's the debate. So anyway, it's been a good weekend for us, and we're really thankful for Laura and the folks from Choices Life Resource Center being here. It's an easy thing to do. Go grab one of those bottles, fill it up with change, or $100 bills, depending on your stage in life, and then we'll bring that back in about a month. It funds really important work for families, for mothers and children at risk here in southern Indiana. It'd be great if you could participate in that. And then I was a little disappointed by the lackluster response to Trunk or Treat beating next Sunday, you guys. Next Sunday. There we go. There we go. We've got rooms for trunks left. There's a map by the welcome table. You can sign up for a trunk. David Cruz just got volunteered to be a trunk. Thank you, David. Appreciate your ministry. And so if you're like, what is Trunk or Treat? What are we doing here? Long story short, you have to dress silly and provide candy. That's like the bare minimum. If you want to take it to a next level, I've heard rumbles of competition. Then you can decorate your car in a theme you want. But really, at the end of the day, dress silly, smile a little bit if you can, and hand out candy. So hopefully you can be a part of that. You can sign up as you're grabbing a baby bottle on the way out, and next week should be a wonderful day for us. I really love this story. Kind of feels like three stories, but they all tie together here in the second half of Mark chapter 5. And when I was reading this, going through the series and trying to, do what I do for a living, verse 21, it just played in my mind like a movie. The very first thing that Erin read for us, it says, Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. And what played in my mind was like a red carpet experience. Jesus gets out of the Rolls Royce and all the paparazzi are there, taking pictures, everybody screaming and wanting to be around Jesus. This crowd had run across the lake to follow Jesus, even though he was tired and wanted a little bit of a break. They sent him away, he goes away, they chase him, and he's there. And I know this doesn't apply to everybody, but are you the kind of person, like me, that's always kind of fantasized about having a red carpet experience? A little bit. You don't have to raise your hand in church. I mean, like you get out of the car and everybody's like, he's here. She's here. And the cameras flash and everybody's like, oh, I want your autograph. Oh, tell me. Have you ever wanted to be wanted like that? Have you ever wanted to be wanted by large groups of people, for people to think that you were important, that you were worthwhile, that you were beautiful, that you were desirable? Have you ever dreamt of stepping out of your car to find huge crowds just waiting to bask in your presence? Ours is a culture, by ours I mean this American culture that we live in, this Western culture. Ours is a culture desperate to be seen and heard. This is crazy what I'm about to say to you, but it's true. A social media influencer is one of the top career goals of our present-day middle and high school students. If you're like, what's a social media influencer? It's somebody that gets paid to be popular on the internet. Like, if I can get enough people to go to my Instagram page, then this shoelace company will pay me money to talk about how great their shoelaces are. Or it's basically, we have a generation of people that their aspiration is to be famous. You all know what I do for a living. This is what I do for a living. When I meet pastors of other churches, which happens frequently, or people in the community, and invariably, because we're Americans, we ask people, what do you do for a living? And when I tell people outside of our church that I'm a pastor, or I meet pastors from other churches, invariably, 9 times out of 10, the first question I get asked, not what's your denomination, not who do you say the Son of Man is, not what do you think about the Bible? The first question I get 9 times out of 10 is, so how many are you running? You guys know what that means? Like, how many humans come to your church on Sunday? And obviously, if more humans come to our church on Sunday, we're a better church. If our crowd is larger, we must be so holy. We come to Jesus. I don't know if anyone's ever told you this, but the way you relate is the way you relate. Don't make the mistake of thinking you relate to God one way and then you relate to people the other way. We relate to God. We come to God in so many ways the same exact way that we come to everything else in life. So what do we do when we come to Jesus? We come to Jesus striving to be impressive, to make a name for ourselves. Have you ever met somebody that's like, my life goal is to be very mediocre and quickly forgotten? Nobody wants to live a life like that. We want to make a name for ourselves. We want to stick out, stand out, be seen, and be heard. And in the church, and I've done this, like we find clever ways to make it sound like we're doing this in the name of God. Some of us do this at work in the name of a better life for our children. We church it up. We put fancy words and images on it. But regardless of what it looks like on the outside, so often this striving to be impressive comes from the same place. Somewhere deep inside, you only want to be seen if you feel invisible. Right? You only go for food if you're hungry. You only want to be heard if you feel ignored. In other words, you only strive to be impressive when you think the crowds and the applause will finally convince you that you are loved. So, we get a scene here that maybe some of you really wonder what it would be like if it was you. Jesus gets off the boat and the crowds are there. The cameras are flashing. I know they didn't have cameras, but just in my mind, I see everybody going crazy for him. What would you expect Jesus to do here? the Savior of the world, on a mysterious mission to rescue, redeem, and reconcile all things, what would you expect him to do? Before we can get his reaction to these crowds, he's interrupted. Verse 22 says, a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. Y'all remember what happens when religious people show up in the presence of Jesus in Mark's gospel? We've talked about it like every week for 3 months now. They fuss with him, they fight against him, they resist him, and they oppose him. When we see leaders of the synagogue, Pharisees, religious leaders, these are not friends of Jesus. And so here we have this big platform ministry moment, and then one of these guys comes up again. But this time is different. Verse 22 continues, when he, that's Jairus, saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live. I mean, can you imagine? Some of you can imagine the desperation here. Make no mistake, Jairus is breaking with his party platform. He's not doing what his side of the aisle is supposed to be doing here. They're the ones that are supposed to be opposing Jesus. But his daughter is dying. He's desperate. He's afraid. What would you do if you were Jesus? This group that Jairus represents, not too long ago told Jesus he was demon-possessed and working with Satan. And then he comes and begs you for help. So over here, you got the guys that are trying to derail your life and ministry, and one of them's finally, now he wants something from you, and you have all these adoring crowds over here celebrating and applauding. Where would you turn your attention to? Who would you choose? Perhaps surprisingly, Jesus leaves the platform in pursuit of the person. Verse 24. Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She'd heard about Jesus, for she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Jesus chooses to go with Jairus, and the crowds keep pressing in all around him. There's a level of desperation like we see in Jairus that would move you to ask help of somebody that you're not supposed to ask help of. But there's an even greater level of hopelessness that doesn't even have the courage to speak. Doesn't even have the courage to try to touch him. Barely has enough courage to just try to reach out and touch the hem of his clothing. See, some of you, when I said you want that red carpet experience, because I can see you guys from here, some of you were like, yeah, like me, we want that. And some of you were like, ugh, no, that sounds awful. Some of you have no interest in being popular, being in front of a crowd. But even if that's you, I recognize we live in a culture that only knows how to celebrate extroversion, that only knows how to celebrate bigger, more, faster. But to be a human is to long to be seen, heard, and known, especially in our pain. And so if you're not an extrovert, if you're not a bigger, more, faster kind of person, this can be particularly paralyzing in our kind of culture. But there's good news here. Jesus stops the moment this woman is healed. He feels the power go out of him. And he looks to the crowds and he says to them in verse 30, who touched me? You notice he doesn't say what happened. He says who. He's not looking for an answer. He's looking for a person. And specifically, Jesus is looking for a person in pain. He doesn't say what happened. He said, who touched me? Jesus leaves the attention of the crowds here in pursuit of a person. And often, he's in pursuit of a person in pain. He doesn't stop here to provide group instruction. He stops here for a personal interaction. He commends this woman's faith. He tells her to go in peace, and he assures her Her suffering is over. Twice now. From the beginning of this story in verse 21 until we get to here, Jesus leaves the platform in pursuit of a person. Do you see it? He gets out of the boat and there's crowds waiting. He doesn't give attention to the crowds. Instead, he focuses on Jairus. The crowds press in around him, and he stops. Doesn't pay attention to the crowds. He pays attention to this bleeding woman. He leaves the potential for applause and popularity and focuses on a desperate, suffering individual. Do you see this? The crowds apparently, or perhaps, think that Jesus has made a mistake. Because after this interaction with this suffering woman, messengers from Jairus' house arrive and tell him, "Your daughter has died." They arrive at the house to find people weeping and wailing over this girl's death. Read my mind? Chip Chrisman, ladies and gentlemen. Chip Chrisman, ladies and gentlemen. You ever get that tickle? You ever tried to talk in front of a couple hundred people with a tickle in your throat? It's awesome. Oh, my man. I'm going to do that again. Okay. So this woman's been miraculously healed, but then messengers come and tell Jairus, "Your daughter's dead." How do you think Jairus felt in that moment? They arrive at the house to find people weeping and wailing over this little girl's death. Understandably so. You ever been in a room after a child has died? The weeping and the wailing is understandable. But Jesus seems confused. Verse 39. Where? "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep." Imagine how ludicrous this would sound if you were in the room. I think here perhaps we see one of the reasons why Jesus wasn't interested in crowds. Again, this group ran around a lake to be with him. We'll see it happen again in just a couple of chapters. Not even a couple of chapters, a couple of verses. People running around a lake to go get time with Jesus. They surrounded him as he left for Jairus' house. They pressed into him as he spoke with the bleeding woman. But now they hear him say, "This little girl is asleep." And they all think she's dead. And how do they react? Verse 40 says, the crowd laughed at him. They laughed at him. Have you ever had a large crowd laugh at you? Not with you, but at you? It's a horrific experience. It's dehumanizing, it's embarrassing, it's vulnerable. These crowds, same crowds adoring Jesus, running around a lake to be with him, only needed a few minutes and 2 sentences before their cheers would turn into laughter. Sometimes the same crowds that shout Hosanna soon shout crucify. The crowd is fickle. The crowd is fickle, which is to say the platform is dangerous. To live for the crowd is to live on a razor's edge. One moment loved, one moment scorned, one moment embraced, the next moment rejected. If you want to be seen and heard, which is human, which is good, which is simply a desire to be loved, you will never find it from a crowd. One moment, just pay attention to the moment in time that we live in. One moment, our culture loves free speech. It's in our Constitution. And the next moment, we hate you for saying something we didn't like. And in fact, we think we should make those words illegal. One moment, our culture champions acceptance until you don't accept the way I think, and then I think we should throw you in prison. Today's joke is tomorrow's outrage. Today's virtue is tomorrow's scandal. The culture and thus the crowd shifts from day to day like a leaf in the wind. To live for that crowd is to chase the wind. The crowd will never see you or hear you. Maybe if there's one thing I can convince you under 30 people of, it would be that. The crowd will never see you. The crowd will never hear you, which means the crowd will never love you. It can't. And perhaps knowing this, that crowds can't see you or hear you and crowds cannot love you, is one reason why Jesus consistently leaves the platform in pursuit of a person. And so often it's a person in pain. Verse 40, the crowd laughed at him, but he made them leave. And he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was laying. Enough with the crowds, he sends them away. Doesn't even need 12 disciples, just 3. Maybe it would have been too many people. I don't know. But we have Jesus, his 3 closest friends, and a desperate, broken-hearted mom and dad. They walk into a dead girl's bedroom. And watch what happens. Verse 41. Holding her hand, he said to her, "Little girl, get up." Little girl, get up. There's 2 things I want to point out here, especially for those who are maybe from southern Indiana. First, do you notice the lack of theatrics here from Jesus? There's no commotion. It was quiet, it was calm, and it was right to the point. He doesn't need to cast a spell, doesn't need to draw a circle on the ground, doesn't need to whip himself into a fury or a frenzy. There's just a lot of people in our area that think for it to be the Spirit of God means it needs to be some kind of a spectacle. It needs to be loud and energetic and enthusiastic, and you got to speak in tongues, and you got to cast spells and do crazy stuff for something incredible to happen. And it really helps if there's cameras rolling and there's lights and there's smoke, and we can all get into this religious fervor. But Jesus says, wake up, no spectacle. Jesus doesn't need a spectacle. Jesus doesn't need a light show. Jesus doesn't need primetime TV coverage. Jesus doesn't need a pep rally. Jesus doesn't need a PR campaign. 5 people in the room saw this. No theatrics, no spectacle. And that was enough for Jesus. The second thing I want you to notice is how tender this is. See how tender? I don't know if you guys have a daughter that you've ever had to wake up in the morning. He took her by the hand. I mean, can you see Jesus doing this? Can you really see it in your imagination? Sitting on the edge of the bed. Have you been in maybe the hospital bed of a loved one, the hospital room of a suffering loved one, and you go and you sit on the edge of their bed, and what do you just naturally do? You take them by the hand. I see Jesus there, and I don't know, maybe he's just gently rubbing the back of her hand with his thumb. It's just so tender. It's so soft and calm. And what does he say to her? You know, maybe he brushed the hair out of her eyes and he said, "Little one, wake up." And she wakes up. It's breathtaking, the tenderness of Jesus. And again, if you were here, maybe if you were Jesus, what would you do after it works? I think most of us American Christians would probably do one of 2 things, if not both. I think some of us, one of the first things we would do is stick our head out the windows to the crowds and say, "Who's laughing now?" It'd be like Michael Jackson, hold her out the window. You remember when he did that with his kid? It's just like in your face, guys. Wouldn't you be tempted to do that? I think it makes me feel more sad. Some of us would want to get back at the crowds. I think a lot of us would probably ask the girl to go sit by the window because the light is just right and we could take a really nice shot for Instagram. We would take a picture of her and we would say, "Thanks be to God for the miracle he's done for us. If you'd like to see more, come visit my website," or "Here's my Venmo, here's my Patreon." You know what I'm saying? Did it really happen if we didn't post about it? Did it really happen if it's not on Facebook or Instagram? Did it really happen if we haven't been celebrated for it? Here's what Jesus did. In verse 43, Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened. Jesus leaves the platform in pursuit of a person. And then, verse 43, he told them to give her something to eat. because I guess dying really takes it out of you. I mean, the tenderness of Jesus. She looks hungry. Can someone get her some food? But Jesus turns his attention away from the crowds to the person right in front of him. He leaves the platform in pursuit of the person over and over and over again. Every story in chapter 5, you will find this. Jesus leaves a crowd to pursue a person, back to back to back. Jesus leaves the platform in pursuit of a person. Have I said that enough? Jesus leaves his platform in pursuit of a person. And so when Jesus says to us, which is his call of discipleship, follow me, the first movement of that invitation is Jesus saying, will you trust me? Part of trusting him means embracing his mysterious mission, which is what we've talked about for several weeks now. And if you're a little bit confused, what do I mean by mysterious mission? Well, it is confusing. Here's some of what I mean. Sometimes Jesus heals with a touch. We've seen this. Remember how he healed the leper? Touched him. Sometimes Jesus heals long distance with a word. He'll say, they're healed. Sometimes Jesus heals by allowing someone else to touch his clothes. You see what I'm saying? I don't know exactly how Jesus heals. It happens all kinds of different ways. What about the ways Jesus teaches? Jesus teaches from the Bible, yes and amen. Sometimes Jesus teaches from nature. Ugh. Sometimes Jesus teaches by telling stories. Sometimes Jesus teaches by telling riddles. And sometimes he doesn't give answers to those riddles. Sometimes Jesus will say to people, go and sin no more. Sometimes, like the woman here, he'll say, your suffering is over. He doesn't even say anything about sin. What are we going to do? Sometimes Jesus raises the dead with a loud shout. He says, Lazarus, come out! Sometimes he raises the dead by gently taking a girl by the hand and saying, little girl, get up. What I want you to notice is that Jesus rarely teaches or heals the same way twice. To one, he'll say, you have to be born again. To another, he'll say, you have to sell all you have and give it to the poor. To one, he'll say, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. To another, he'll say, the kingdom of heaven is like buried treasure. To trust Jesus when he says, follow me, means to have confidence that he will care for you, while also admitting you're not always sure how. I know he showed up that way for your brother. I don't know how he'll show up for you. But here's what we can say for sure. Jesus consistently leaves the platform in pursuit of a person, which is to say, Jesus does not want crowds, he wants you. So we confidently cry out to him. As Hebrews says, we boldly approach the throne of grace, not because we know exactly what Jesus will do for us, but because we're confident he's not listening to the crowds, he's listening to me. And I can come straight into his presence because he's not interested in the crowds, he's interested in me. So trust him. With everything he has going on, he leaves the 99 for the one. Trust him. He leaves the platform. He leaves the crowds in pursuit of you. Trust him. When he invites us to follow him, it means to trust him. And it means to learn from him so we can live like him. Every one of us in this room has heard it said, be seen, be heard, make a name for yourself. Look out for number one. You've heard some version of it, but I say to you, because Jesus says to you, follow the way of the Lamb of God, which is the way of the mustard seed, not the way of the platform, not the way of bigger, more, better, faster. Look not to the crowds or the platform or applause to learn how beloved you are. You won't find it there. Instead, look to Jesus. Because if you look to Jesus, I promise you, you will see him looking back at you. Cry out to Jesus, because when you do, you'll learn that he listens to you. And as you do, you will find in him all the love you'll ever need. You'll see yourself as the object of Jesus' mission, because Jesus' mission is always personal. So trust him, follow him, and may we become a people who live like him. He leaves the platform in pursuit of the person. He doesn't want crowds, church. He wants you. If you're willing and able, stand with me and we'll pray together.